Alright ladies, this screencast is going to pick up with kind of the beginning of chapter 6, so likely your class will be able to fast forward beyond this point to where we left off in your particular class, but this is going to be the whole beginning part, okay? So the last topic we covered in class of Unit 2 was discussing the fact that the colonists do win the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris 1783 has been signed and ratified, thus we are a free independent country, and a free independent country needs a new government, okay, because we have just broken from our former one. Now the Founding Fathers actually kind of were somewhat prepared with this. They essentially will have a government in place during the Revolution. The Second Continental Congress, that same kind of assembly that passed things like the Olive Branch Petition and the Declaration of Independence, they will also be the group of men to create the first official government we have in this country, which was not the Constitution. That was not our first written plan of government, okay? In fact, we're going to kind of crash and burn a little bit in the beginning and have a bit of a rougher start, but point is that those Founding Fathers in the Second Continental Congress knew we needed a plan from the beginning, because just in case we did win the war, we would need to have a government in place for that time. So the first official written government in the United States is actually going to be the Articles of Confederation. And I'm thinking that's something we've learned about in civics prior to this class. And honestly, this is a very different setup than what we have today, so keep in mind that our first system of government is going to fail and we ended up with something different in the long run, but for now we're going to talk about that first specific example. So essentially, those initial patriots, they don't want to create a super elaborate government that has a super powerful national government. Think about this. They're fighting a war to rebel against the monarchy, so they kind of want to have a more relaxed national government and give more rights to the people and the states themselves individually. So they want to very much create a limited national government so that history doesn't repeat itself. So because of that, they're going to create a government in which the national government, the government of the whole 13 states, is actually very weak. For example, under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. government has only one branch of government, the legislative. That's the lawmaking branch. So the president doesn't exist, the Supreme Court doesn't exist, it's just the legislative branch, just the lawmakers. Another example of how the national government was weak under the Articles is that it could not impose taxes, which means it can't collect revenue from the citizens, and it also can't regulate trade. So two pretty important rights, taking away, the ability of the government to really govern effectively, okay? Also, one weakness of the Articles of Confederation was that you had to have a unanimous vote, meaning all 13 states would have to approve to change or amend any of the articles. So if they wanted to make any change to the present government, they had to have a 100% vote, which means it's never going to happen. So you can never improve or grow or change. Imagine if our government was still the exact same as it was since the 1770s, women still probably wouldn't be voting today. So that's a pretty weak setup that no one can amend the articles pretty much. So overall, our central government, the new government, is very weak, and parts of the country are in conflict because the central government has no power to do anything about it. There are issues arising, little tiny disagreements between states, and the central government is too weak to regulate and try to improve their states or any sort of issue or matter in any way. So it's pretty clear changes need to be made. The articles are not going to be a long-term success. Thus, we will have to call a new meeting to come up with Plan B. And that's going to happen just within, the first 5 years of having this new country. Okay? So essentially a new meeting is created or called the Philadelphia Convention, held in Philadelphia, obviously. we know this convention now instead is the Constitutional Convention, but that's only because the Constitution is the document that's going to be created here. At the time, they didn't know that's what they were going to write. They didn't even know they were going to write a new government at all. They just were going to talk things out. But because we do end up with the Constitution, we know the Philadelphia Convention as the Constitutional Convention today. Delegates from all 13 states, actually, side note, except Rhode Island. Rhode Island did not attend. Don't need to know why, but they didn't come. But everyone else shows up in Philadelphia. George Washington is selected to preside over the convention. He's just someone, once again, that all the colonies can unite, all the states can unite behind, since he was the war hero from the American Revolution. And I think, honestly, they initially planned just to change a few things in the Articles, but that idea is abandoned quickly because they pretty much realized they need to restart and kind of start from scratch. They have too many problems going on. They need a whole new plan for government. And of course, that new plan they're going to end up with eventually is the Constitution. Just kind of a note here about James Madison. James Madison is going to be our founding father that writes the final plans for what becomes the Constitution. He's not the only author, but he's kind of the one to collaborate a lot of things into the governing document. So he is known as the father of the Constitution. Now, it's not easy just to come up with a brand new plan from scratch. There are several issues that need to be worked out at this convention because not all the states agree with each other. And these issues are going to result in some pretty important compromises and decisions that still affect our country today. So, several issues at the convention. The first we're going to be talking about is the issue between small states and large states. So, this issue is an argument over representation in Congress and how it should be determined. Like, how do we determine how many representatives a state should have, and some people have an opinion on exactly how many representatives a state should have in the federal Congress, federal legislature. And so two different types of states. Like, if you were a small state, you had one theory. If you were a large state, you had a different theory on this process. And they each are reflected in a plan. Virginia is the larger state compared to New Jersey, as you see on your outline. Those are the two plans. So we'll look at Virginia plan first. The Virginia plan was the proposal that was favored by the larger states. The Virginia plan called for a bicameral legislature. And a bicameral legislature, like I said, just means there are two houses in Congress. So they want there to be two houses, and they want representation in these houses to be based on population. Okay, so they want basically to determine how many, based on your state's population would determine how many representatives your state gets. The bigger states, the more populated states, get more representation because they are representing more voices. Okay, you would see why larger states would be in favor of that plan because they get a bigger say. And they have a point. They have more people living there. However, who's going to oppose this? The smaller states. Because that means anyone living in that state, a smaller state, wouldn't have as much say in theory because their vote doesn't count as much in Congress. So the smaller states plan is going to be reflected in the New Jersey plan. So the New Jersey plan is the plan favored by the smaller, less populated states. Keep in mind that when I say larger and smaller states, I'm not necessarily talking about physical geography. I'm talking about population. Our least populated state today in 2018 is Wyoming, and it's certainly not the smallest physically, but just the less Americans live there than any other state, which is hard to believe, but true. So, again, it's based on population. So the New Jersey plan was favored by smaller states. They basically want every state to have one vote. They want there to be one house in Congress, and they want every single state to have one vote. So how do we compromise on this issue? The compromise that kind of gives a solution to this issue is known as the Great Compromise. And it's a very easy solution. Let's give them both what they want. We'll have two houses in Congress. One will be based on representation, and one house will have equal representation amongst all of the states that we have. And you know that today as the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives is the house that representation is based on population, meaning there are more representatives coming out of states that have more people living in them than the smaller states. But in the Senate, every state gets exactly 2 U.S. senators. There's no more than 2 senators representing each state individually. So you both get, it's kind of like a compromise and a meshing of both plans together, and that's known as the Great Compromise. So that issue's been solved. What's next? Now that we know how representation will be determined, the next concern is over the institution of slavery and kind of connecting into representation. This issue is between the North and the South. There's 2 different opinions of slavery in general between the North and the South, and then leading into representation. So in terms of the institution of slavery, at this point in history, the northern states are beginning to oppose slavery. They pretty much want to abolish it. Not every single person, but just collectively, that's the general trend. Whereas the southern states are still very much relying economically on slaves as their free labor system. So they very much want to maintain slavery. And they want slavery to, be an existing institution in this country. One compromise here is they're not going to outlaw slavery in the Constitution at this point. However, they are going to decide at this point in this Constitutional Convention that the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, is only going to exist for 20 more years. There's only going to be 20 more years of allowance for African slaves to be brought in from Africa to North America, to the American states. After that, the slave trade will no longer exist. Now, the slave trade could still exist from within the states, but not, the purchasing of slaves coming straight from Africa. That exists. That institution will have to stop after 20 years. Something to keep in mind as we look to future units. Now that we know slavery is going to exist in the states still, I keep saying colonies, maybe say states. They're states now. They won the war. The South wants to count their slave population in the number of their state's general population so that they could earn more representatives towards Congress. Like, if one of the houses of Congress, the House of Reps, is based on population, they want their slave population to be included in that number. Obviously, the South would like this idea because they have the most slaves, and that would get them more votes. Obviously, the North opposes this idea because they have less slaves and don't want the Southern vote to outweigh or outnumber the Northern vote. Not to mention, they're wondering, why does the South get to, include these voices or count these voices as part of the population when they don't get to vote or anything like that, which quite frankly makes a lot of sense. So there is that issue, and this will be resolved with the 3/5 compromise. Essentially, 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted in a state's population to determine things like representation. Also, you could look at this like 3/5 of a person. The math adds up the same. You've heard it both ways probably. So 3/5 of the whole state's population, each slave would count as 3/5 of a vote when determining representation in Congress. So the South's gonna somewhat get what they want, but not 100%, and that's the compromise that the North is willing to give. All right, we're gonna stop this screencast here, and I'm gonna be picking up with central versus state powers Monday in class. We'll be moving quickly, so bear with me on that. If you have any questions, please write them down, and I will see you all on Monday.